On this episode of Museum Diaries, telling fake from fabulous.
Everything is being faked today. If it hasn't been faked, if it hasn't been counterfeited, then it doesn't exist.
Dirty tricks, knockoffs, and lies that must be unveiled.
The bottom here is genuine. So the bottom here dates to around 600 AD. The top is not. The top is from the 1920s.
The Royal Ontario Museum has an elite team of experts. Their mission is to detect fakes, correct mistakes, and stop looted objects from coming in. Knowledgeable, observant, and perseverant, they weed out the bad apples to get it right. Paul Denis.
One of my activities is to go through previous acquisitions that have been in the museum for quite some time and to separate the sheep from the goats, what is good and what is bad.
Susan Stock.
I'm responsible for the conservation of all the metal collections at the Royal Ontario Museum.
Justin Jennings.
My job is all the Americas, and I deal with all the material from before Columbus.
April Hawkins, Laura Lipsey, and Catherine Donnell.
Everything is being faked today. If it hasn't been faked, if it hasn't been counterfeited, then it doesn't exist.
These are the experts that make up the ROM's investigative unit. Like many other collections, the Royal Ontario Museum was established in the early 1900s, when collecting became a passion, a matter of pride, and an obsession.
During the early part of the 20th century, there were many types of collecting booms. In 1922, when Howard Carter discovered King Tut's tomb, there was an Egyptomania spread across Europe and North America. People had to have a piece of Egyptian art, not only collectors, but museums as well.
The ROM?
It opened in 1914, and the director was a guy, Charles Corelli. Now, Corelli was an archaeologist, but he was an Egyptologist. He worked in Egypt, he knew all about the Mediterranean, he knew a little bit about China and some connections there, but in terms of Latin America, he knew very little. So, for example, in Mexico in the 1850s, so long before the museum opened, they were selling stuff on the streets.
Egypt, Rome, Mexico, China, you name it, it was the Wild West of collecting.
After a while, because there's so much money involved, the fakers step in to meet the demand.
Looters and forgers, cheaters and liars, museums around the world were inundated with knockoffs. But in some cases, archaeologists themselves naively created so-called Frankenpieces.
The excavations at the turn of the century weren't necessarily controlled the way they are now. So when people found pieces together, they weren't critical of, does this actually associate and belong to this? It's like, this looks like it could be the top to this. It fits. And then because it didn't look good, they covered the whole thing over so that, nobody was suspicious of the fact that it was fragmentary.
The ROM opened in 1914, but we were building up our collection earlier than that. And so the expertise wasn't as good as it is now, and so forgeries naturally seeped into the collections. Going through the collections, one can see the various mistakes that were made in the past, and we have to separate them. We don't want to put them on display as being the real thing.
Paul Denis has seen his share of knockoffs. So much so, he created an exhibit called Fakes and Forgeries, Yesterday and Today, that has toured across Canada.
The public is fascinated with fakes and forgeries, and it's great to have the original object placed next to the forgery.
One of the most iconic knockoffs are the famous Tanagra figurines.
What they did in ancient Tanagra is bury these figurines with the dead in their cemetery. The local farmers who were farming the field in 1871 stumbled upon these graves. Within approximately 6 years, the cemetery was cleaned out. 10,000 graves had been looted, and all of the figurines inside had been sent to market, flooding the market of Athens, London, Paris with genuine figurines. As always, the supply of genuine figurines ran out, and so this is when the forger happily steps in to meet the demand for these figurines. This figurine, if you look at her drapery, it is not well formed. A lot of the folds don't lead anywhere, and her head is much too large in proportion for the rest of the figure. So this is a late 19th century fake. Here's the genuine piece. The drapery is treated much more delicately, and her facial features are beautifully executed, very finely done. I found out that even fossils are fake because they're highly collectible. According to the ROM's paleontologists, the most prolific and expert forgers of fossils are made in Morocco today. So if you're walking along the beach in Morocco and somebody offers you a fossil, it's buyer beware.
The exhibit also includes contemporary knockoffs.
About 75 to 80% of all the counterfeits come out of China. And in China, you have a lot of legitimate manufacturing. And the legitimate manufacturing goes on in factories that are basically safe, they're checked, they're verified, but in the same country and sometimes in the same area, another factory will set up, and that factory won't even necessarily have a sign on the door. You won't even know that it's a factory. And yet if you go inside, we have found forced labor, child labor, slave labor, and that's what people are buying into when they're buying counterfeit products.
Lauren Lipkiss is one of Toronto's top intellectual property lawyers and assisted Paul in curating the contemporary portion of the Fakes Traveling exhibit.
Inkjet cartridges, light bulbs, really popular toy, hair straightening irons, sunglasses, Bluetooth headset. This one really bothers me. It's wax crayons that have never been tested. And yet what do children do? Young children will put these in their mouth. There's two different categories of counterfeits. Category 1, anything. Category 2, everything. When I say anything and everything, I show people a jar of pickles. And I tell people that if they're counterfeiting jars of pickles, that's anything and everything.
Charles Corelli wanted to have stuff from Peru or from Mexico or from the southwest of the United States. And so what he began to do in the 1920s began to go on expeditions, get some material, but also look for donations and look for collections you could buy.
Justin Jennings is the curator of New World Archaeology here at the ROM. He is determined to authenticate the ROM's massive South American collection.
In 1914, when he was starting to build the collection, there weren't a lot of laws in place in terms of antiquities. You could go out and you could buy just about anything.
Oftentimes we didn't understand really enough about those cultures or really understand the provenance of those objects.
Charles Corelli went down to Mexico, was looking around for different opportunities to purchase or to dig up these objects. He found a guy who was a diplomat, a British diplomat in Mexico, who was looking to have someone purchase his collection. And so he offered us this stuff for about $10,000, a collection of some 700 objects. Now, a lot of those objects were Zapotec, and many of those were some of the best urns that Corelli and others had ever seen.
I'm the only one that is supposed to handle the collection, and because of that, I know it very well.
April Hawkins is a technician in the ROM's New World Archaeology Department and is the keeper of its more than 400,000 artifacts.
So I really wanted to be able to touch the objects. I wanted to be able to care for the objects. So that's how I got this position. And that's what I do every day. Everything I do is around how to properly take care of these objects.
The Zapotec are around 200 to about 800 AD, at least the height of the Zapotec culture. And they have this incredible art that's the biggest and sort of most impressive things are these urns that have these fantastic creatures, sometimes priests dressed up in costumes. When you get something from a purchase, you're always worried that, well, okay, is it fake? Is it authentic? Is it not? It's always hard to tell. The first batch of work on these Zapotec urns occurred in the 1970s when a Mexican colleague came up and she asked us to take some samples. We took a small sample from the base and ground it into powder and then sent that to a lab. And the whole idea of thermoluminescence is that you have this powder and you just basically burn it. But there are electrons trapped inside the matrix of the ceramic. If something's 100 years old, it will just have a little bit of this radiation. If it's say 1,000 years old, it'll have more. And so the idea was quite simple, is well, we'll just burn it, we'll heat it up enough, this stuff comes out and we measure how much light escapes. And that idea of thermoluminescence allowed us to understand how old the pot was.
The first test revealed what many had feared. Corelli had been misled into buying Zapotec knockoffs.
Sometimes these artists are very good. Their ancestors are the people that made these, right? They're using the same clays. It can be very difficult sometimes to decide, was this made in 1950 or was this made in 400 AD?
This piece is a Shang Dynasty wine vessel. It's called a Zun, Z-U-N. It's been in fragments for a long time.
Susan Stock is a senior conservator. Her job at the ROM is to complete the conservation of the metal artifacts within its collections.
This is the way it would have looked when it was intact when it came into the Royal Ontario Museum. Shortly after the photograph was taken, the object fell to pieces, unfortunately, and it stayed that way for many, many years. So I started to assemble the lower portion, which was in pieces, and they're good joints. And as I had assembled this, I wanted to make sure that this piece, the cup that fits on top, was going to belong. This would have been the final step. There was a very, very dark black line, which was an old repair, which I thought was disfiguring. So I thought I would do a very quick cosmetic fix-up of this line and then stick the pieces back together and it would be finished and ready to go on display. In the past, a lot of pieces in the ROM collection were repaired with a material called Durham's Rock Hard Water Putty. So I started excavating the filling material, and you can see by what remains that in actual fact the entire object was covered with about a ½ inch of filling material. I became worried because looking at it visually, both using an optivisor and under the microscope, you can see very clearly, or it's clear to me, that the corrosion, the color of the corrosion and the quality of the corrosion is very different along the joint from these pieces which form the basis of the funnel and this section of the cup which forms the foot. So I thought that was a bit strange. I decided that maybe I was going to have to do something a little bit more adventurous to give me the answers that I needed.
After being a curator 30 years, you just get a general feeling of the object, whether it's Greek, Roman, or Etruscan, or even Byzantine. So first, there's just this general impression. Is this thing real? Is it fake? What am I looking at? So here are the Tanagra terracotta figurines, similar to the examples that are on display in the Niagara History Museum. One of them is genuine and one is fake. In determining whether these were fake or genuine, looking at this example, you can see how clumsy the arms are done. They're very out of proportion. The head is much too small. It's at a very weird angle. And then the hair is very crudely done. Then when you look at the genuine example, you can see that it is much more finely made. The drapery is much finer. Their facial features are very fine and delicate, that's something you would expect to find on a genuine Tanagra figurine.
These spots too are indicative of an object found in burial. You often find these black spots across the surface of ceramics.
These spots are something which cannot be faked.
Right.
Since they occur naturally over thousands of years.
Paul also dealt with a pair of idols whose authenticity was questioned.
It's called red burnished ware. It's terracotta that has been burnished after it's been fired to give it this very glossy surface. And the depiction is of a standing mother, and she's holding a child in her arms, and it's very abstract, and it's actually quite modern looking. They're very attractive pieces. And then looking at the back, you can see her hair has been etched in, and then part of the decoration of the textile she's wearing. One of them is a genuine early Bronze Age Cypriot idol. It dates from about 2000 BC. And the other one is of recent manufacture. It's fake. So no cigar for this one because it is much too thick and it looks like it was made with a cookie cutter.
Usually when we're determining whether something is a fake or not, it's usually a collaborative process. Paul brings the art connoisseurship into the discussion, whereas conservators are interested in materials and techniques. So we take samples, we drill samples. Unfortunately, it's a destructive technique. These samples are then fired a second time, and in that process, the energy emitted is collected in the form of light and then measured, which tells us when the last time it was fired, and in effect, approximately how old it is.
And the test has shown that this figurine is approximately 4,000 years old, which proves it's genuine.
Okay, so yeah, let's take a look at HMH 1898 here. You know, a fake, we know it's a fake, but it's an interesting piece. Even though these are fakes, they're 100-year fakes, you know. So these are artifacts in their own right.
The issue here, April, is that this headdress, right? It says it looks kind of cool. The face is totally Zapotec, but this headdress isn't. This headdress is Maya lowlands. There is clearly a Zapotec way of dressing, clearly a Maya way of dressing. Different groups were particular about the identity, particular about what they wore. And so you look at these pieces, at these turbans, and they just aren't Zapotec. Zapotec people didn't wear those. This is a one-of-a-kind piece. And what's interesting in this piece is it's a pastiche in the sense that the bottom here is genuine. So the bottom here dates to around 600 AD. The top is not. The top is from the 1920s, or maybe a little bit earlier. We'll take the thermoluminescence test. On the bottom, you'll say, wow, this thing's genuine. But then if you take one from the top, you'll find out that it's been put together. Sometimes you have a fake and someone will actually make a new one, a new ear spool, but sometimes they'll just say, wow, I've got some extra ear spools from this legitimate piece that's been shattered. I'll just put these into this piece and make it better.
So this one's authentic, this one's fake. Each of these pastiches, each of these molds that are attached to this object are genuine, they look authentic, they are correct for Zapotec urns, and this one is as well. But this one passes the TL test, this one does not. Otherwise, it's impossible to tell. Wow, so this is good pastiche. So these ear spools, this section right here, the hands, look at the hands. And this face. So all of these would have been pressed into molds. So that's how the pastiche effect works. If you have a mold, you can make numerous copies and paste them onto various pots.
In the early 2000s, another researcher came in, did more of our pots, found out more of them were fake. And it turns out that about half of our bigger pieces are fake and about half are real.
Hi. How are you?
Good.
So we're looking at this piece, and I have questions about whether the cup actually fits to the base.
Okay.
And you can see that, you know, even though the surface is modeled and the corrosion is different all over this piece, it really bears very little resemblance to this. And you can see that a lot of the pieces are, you know, obviously married in.
These look Frankenstein.
Those little, yeah, completely.
So why don't you fit it together and then we'll mark the pieces.
Okay.
This is a XRF machine. It's a handheld XRF, which means that it's an X-ray fluorescence machine. And it actually injects X-rays into materials, excites the atoms, and when they fall back, there's characteristic energies that they emit. And this grabs it and reads them as elements. We're dealing with iron,
That's a lot of iron. That's a huge iron peak.
copper,
Okay.
tin.
Okay, it's a bronze.
Yeah. So we have tin, iron, similar peaks in copper, trace amounts of lead, and a little bit of tin. Definitely, given these scans, this edge from here to here is the same material. And this one definitely isn't. So this area here, these sort of weirder colored areas, really lacks any sort of iron peak at all, where these ones tend to have a real presence of iron, right?
But it's still not what I was expecting.
Yeah.
After doing the XRF today, I'm looking at the results and I am still not satisfied that the base and the funnel actually belong together. So I am going to look at comparative data to see if Shang Dynasty material actually had iron peaks. If I come to the conclusion based on the analysis that the material is comparable, then I will marry the base and the funnel again and finish the restoration or conservation, the cosmetic conservation of the losses so that it looks more attractive, and hopefully it will go out on display.
Yeah, so this is probably one of the more famous pieces that we have. It's a Heine figurine that's so-called for an island off the coast of Mexico. So it's Maya, classic Maya. So we're talking around 350 to 700 AD. And what it is, it's a Maya lord looking into a mirror. So this would have been a highly buffed stone mirror. And the idea is that you sort of see the divine. You see a different world by looking inside of it. This particular piece and this particular posture is unique. And so because it's unique, people have questions. They say, oh, well, people usually didn't lay this way. They wouldn't have themselves propped up this way. And so it's enough of a question that now we're beginning to pull this piece out and say, okay, is this real or not?
Can we test the Maya blue?
Yeah, we should be able to test the Maya, because the Maya blue is famous. It's actually, it's a heat-treated indigo. So it's a very special process. The chemistry is going to be quite distinct from what you'd get in a modern pigment that would be that blue.
I think we should test this one because it's been very contentious. It would be great to know.
Well, yeah, certainly, because I love the piece.
Yeah,
I
do
want
too.
it to be
It's
real.
cool.
I
Yeah.
want it to be out there. It says a lot about the Maya and about their beliefs. The folks that are really trying to fake something that's, that's $100,000, $200,000 on the market, they know what's going to trigger some of those experts. It's a game, right? That folks are one step, two steps ahead. You try to catch up. As soon as you catch up, they're finding a way to fake the thermoluminescence, to fake this, to fake that. At the end of the day, you can tell if it's a fake, but you're never completely certain it's authentic.